was there in order to do archival research, and I started writing about efforts to secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had some small voting rights provisions, and more dominantly efforts to secure passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I hope each of you is at least a little bit familiar with that. And that's been one of my primary areas of interest. So it started when I was a student. Many years later, I wrote a book about the efforts to pass the Voting Rights Act, especially the demonstrations in Selma, and perhaps some of you will watch the film Selma that is part of the Unlearn Week later on. And so in the demonstrations, and then also Lyndon Johnson's speech called We Shall Overcome that followed. I think I've been especially lucky. I was able to interview some members of the Justice Department at the time, namely Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the Attorney General. And I even had the good fortune to appear on TV with John Lewis, who maybe some of you know, which is really, quite honestly, one of the highlights of my life, I would say. So that's a bit of my interest and experience. In addition to that, I'm also interested and have written about efforts for women to secure equal access to the ballot box, and especially black women. So I've written a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois, maybe some of you know, who's a prominent civil rights leader, especially at the turn of the century, helped found the NAACP. He was one of the few black men who supported women's suffrage, and then right now, I'm actually on sabbatical leave, and I'm working on a project related to black women's advocacy for voting rights, and in particular, a speech from 1866, which is really historically important, and I think has contemporary resonances. It's by somebody I imagine most of you have never heard of. Her name is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and so I have an interest in that as well. So that's tells you a little bit about why a communication professor might be talking about these things. Although it matters a lot to me as a citizen and personally as well. It's not just an academic interest, although it is a strong academic interest. Okay. So I'm here mainly today to talk about why public advocacy for equal voting rights is not just a matter of historical interest, though, right? You have to understand the history, but it is not just something in the past. When I first started studying the history of voting rights, I assumed, perhaps like many of you, that the United States has been on a pretty steady trajectory towards guaranteeing equal access to the ballot box, right? That, maybe it sort of didn't start out so good, right? But that through constitutional amendments and laws and Supreme Court rulings, right, there's this kind of steady march of progress toward expanded voting rights. But that is not true. Right? That's a narrative that's often told, but is a narrative that is completely false, right? That efforts to restrict access have been as common as efforts to expand it. Just for example, right, because of the research I'm doing right now, for a long time, women in New Jersey were allowed to vote. Long time before the 19th Amendment, right? And then it was taken away from them. So, they were the only women in the United States for a very long time who were allowed to vote because the state granted them the right to vote. And then when people started calling more attention to suffrage, women's vote in New Jersey was taken away. Okay, so that's just one example. All right. I also assumed when I started doing research, like many people, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had kind of finally taken care of voter suppression efforts, with a couple of notable exceptions, of course, things like gerrymandering and also the disfranchisement of people who've been convicted of felonies in many states. I assumed that things like, right, strategic purging of voter rolls, manipulation of polling places, rejection of registration forms and ballots because of minor mistakes, that these were just problems of the bad old days, right? The days of Jim Crow. But once again, unfortunately, that is not true, right? That is not just a thing of the past. Each of these things has reared its ugly head again. I also assumed that the US Supreme Court would be firmly on the side of equal voting rights. But if you've been following the news recently, very recently, as of the summer, but also from a while back, two recent rulings show that that's not true, that the Supreme Court is not clearly on the side of equal voting rights, I would say. And although personally I want to hope that the US Congress will act to curb some states' efforts to undermine equal access to the franchise, right, the vote, I'm not confident that it will, at least without significant advocacy by people like us, right? We, the people. So it's really important that advocates of equal voting rights, which I hope would be everybody, right? Everybody should be an advocate for equal voting rights, it seems to me, right? But that I hope, because it's really important for advocates of equal voting rights to make this voter disfranchisement seem like a democratic problem, not a technocratic problem, right? That people often get focused on, right? Does this violate the law? Does it violate the Constitution, right? And not put it in the perspective of, you know what? Trying to keep people from voting is wrong, right? It is a wrong thing to do in American democracy. And it's sad that that advocacy needs to keep happening, but I'm here to tell you that it does, okay? So to continue our discussion of this problem, I don't want this just to be me talking all the time, is that I want to ask you some questions, and it can be as interactive as you make it, which I hope will be a lot, but we'll see how it goes, right? I've been teaching for a long time, as I mentioned before. It's the end of the day. I know sometimes how these things go, all right? But we'll make the best of it, okay? And don't feel like, you're not gonna respond because, again, you're worried that you don't know enough. So let me ask a few questions that I think will highlight some of the challenges related to guaranteeing equal access to the ballot box. All right, so I just have a series of them here. Raise your hand if you think you have some insights into this, all right? So why, right? Why are African Americans in particular, right, and ethnic minorities more generally allowed to vote in the United States now, right? It hasn't always been the case, of course, as I'm sure you know, right? There's not always been the case. So why, right? What is it that enables African Americans in particular and other ethnic minorities more broadly to vote in the United States right now? Why, right? It's easy to presume like, oh, well, that's just how it is. It is not just how it is, right? Certainly is not how it's always been. So why? Anyone know? Anyone want to take a crack at why? Why? Yeah. It's a constitutional right. That's like that much true, right? Although it's often what we hear, I would say, right? It's sort of true, I would say. There's a measure of truth to it, but only a measure, I would say. Anyone else? Just curious. All right. So I would say, whether it's a right or not is one thing, but why people, African Americans, are allowed to vote is connected with the Constitution, and in particular is connected with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, right? So if you're wondering, right, what is it that with some degree of certainty helped establish, that helped allow African Americans and other ethnic minorities to vote, is the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1870, okay? So after the Civil War, right, by about 5 years, it was ratified, okay? What's important to note is that it says the right to vote, right, or I'm trying to remember if it says the right to vote. Actually, it just says the vote, right, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of, I think it's a race, color, or a previous condition of servitude, is what it says. Okay, so it's the 15th Amendment. All right. So another question, why can women vote in the United States? As I mentioned before, that has not always been the case. It's not something that women were able to take for granted for a long time, right? So why can women vote in the United States? Anyone? Anyone know? Right? What was it that helped make the change? All right. Don't be shy. Right? All right. Well, it is a constitutional amendment again, right? So the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified. Anybody know when it was ratified? Really long. 1920, right? Women could not vote consistently, right, in all the states until 1920, right? So it's a constitutional amendment. Once again, right, the vote, right, shall not be abridged or denied on account of sex, is the way that it reads in the constitutional amendment. All right, so why can 18-year-olds vote? For a long time, people who were between 18 and 21, for example, could not vote. But of course, now you can vote while you're 18. So why is that? Yep. Yeah, so why is it that 18-year-olds can vote now when that was not always the case? Okay. Although, and this is kind of my point, I mean, that is part of it, I would say, right? But there are lots of things that we perceive to be unfair that persist, right? Fair enough, right? I mean, it's important to keep that in mind, right? There are lots of things that people might perceive as being problematic and being as unfair, and nonetheless, that's life, right? And including, that's political life, okay? You couldn't show up to the ballot box and say, hey, I had to serve in the army and I'm 19 and now I'm back and I want to vote. And they say, well, hey, by all means, clear path to the ballot box, right? I'm being silly, but right, that wouldn't have been allowed. So why is it then, right? What permits it? All right. If you're seeing a trajectory here, you should, right? A constitutional amendment again, right? 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed in 1971, right? Which notes that the right to, that the vote shall not be denied or abridged in the United States or any state on the account of, right? And then it explains age, right? And so it sets 18 as the barrier. Okay, so all of those things are constitutional amendments. And what is worth noting here, right, is it says, it shall not be abridged or denied on account of, and then there's something, right? Does this make sense to everybody? Because this is important. All right, a couple of other questions. Do you guys know what the poll tax is? Right? So the poll tax was something that would be, if you want to vote, you have to pay money, all right? Was this a neutral thing? Oh, well, everybody can afford to pay the poll tax and it's all good. We just need the money for something? No. Okay, right? The poll tax was a strategic element in Jim Crow laws, all right? Well, you don't have to pay the poll tax anymore. So why don't you have to pay the poll tax anymore? Anybody want to take a guess? Right? I've been leading you along, right? It is a constitutional amendment, right? The 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in, sadly, 1964 is when the poll tax was firmly eliminated. Here's the interesting thing, though, if you read the amendment closely, is that it only disqualifies the poll tax in federal elections, right? So technically, if a state wanted to have the poll tax for its state and local elections, right, there is nothing firmly in the Constitution that prohibits them from doing so. If you feel slightly anxious about that, I would say maybe you should feel slightly anxious about that, quite honestly, the way things go sometimes, all right? A couple of last ones, and I'll move these through more quickly, right? Just other things to think about, right? Why don't you have to take a literacy test when you vote? For example, literacy, you guys know what literacy test is for a long time, right? Literacy test would be used to disqualify people, right? Can you demonstrate they have a command of the English language? But then there'd be other questions kind of tacked onto that. So why is it that you don't have to take a literacy test when you vote? In this case, it is not a constitutional amendment, right? It is because of US Supreme Court decisions to some extent, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to some extent, but mainly the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been weakened significantly, which raises the specter. Are things like literacy tests remnants of the bad old days, or will things like that make an ugly reappearance? Okay? Because there is no constitutional amendment that speaks to this issue. Similarly, you might say, well, what if somebody is a convicted felon who has served their time? They can vote, right? So why is that? Well, this one is actually a bit of a trick question. In some states, people who are convicted felons who have served their time can vote, and in some states they cannot. And in fact, in 11 states, there are certain crimes that if you have been convicted of them and served your time, you are still permanently disfranchised. You will never get your vote back, ever, in 11 states in the United States. And there is nothing constitutionally that prohibits it. And the last one, which may be surprising to many of you as well, is that if you're a person who has been deemed mentally incapacitated or mentally incompetent, right? Are you allowed to vote? Is there any barrier? And the answer, once again, is it depends. It depends where you live. That there are 39 states that restrict voting for people who in some legal sense have been declared mentally incapacitated or mentally incompetent. And sometimes that includes people who are autistic, for example, right? And some states, if they have been declared for other reasons mentally incapacitated, that they cannot vote, okay? So for these last things, you may be wondering, how in the world is that, right? Here's the thing, and I hope you'll take several things away from today, but if nothing else, I really, really hope you will take this away, right? That these questions that I have asked you and the answers to them should make something clear. Voter discrimination is completely permissible in the United States as long as it does not fall into one of the categories that is prohibited by a handful of constitutional amendments. Okay, it's a long sentence, so I'll say it again, right? But it is important to recognize, right? Voter discrimination in the United States is not illegal, right? As long as it does not fall into one of the categories prohibited by a small number of constitutional amendments, okay? That is often news to many people, right? It doesn't seem to jive with your understanding of what American democracy and American voting is all about. But my friends, it is the truth, right? That is the reality of voting in the United States. Okay. So you might think, well, is this something that I should be worried about? Not surprisingly, I think, yes, it is something that you really should be worried about. And if you feel indifferent about it now, I hope that I will be able to convince you that you should be concerned about it. So for evidence, one piece of evidence for my claim that this is something that is a significant problem and it is something that you should be concerned about, let me quote from a document from a long time ago, right, for none of us here was alive during this time. It is from a 1959 report by the US Commission on Civil Rights. It's a government agency in charge of looking at the state of civil rights issues in the United States, all right? So it's from a report of 1959, which sadly remains relevant today, I would say. Here's the quote. All right. The history of voting in the United States shows, and the experience of this commission confirmed, that where there is will and opportunity to discriminate against certain potential voters, ways to discriminate will be found. Okay? That is as true today as it was in 1959. Sadly, right? Where there is will to discriminate against certain voters and there is a way to do it, ways will be found, right? And one of the main things that stood in the way before was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but as I mentioned, and maybe some of you know already, that the Supreme Court has weakened two key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to the extent that there's barely anything left of it, okay? All right. So given that, it's useful to think about questions like, right, to educate yourself. Is there an opportunity to discriminate? Yes, there is an opportunity for states to establish voting practices that are discriminatory, right? Again, as long as they don't violate the constitutional amendments, those categories, there are ways to do it. People have found ways to do it in the past, and people are finding ways to do it now. Right? I'm sure you know many of these things, right? Things like purging voter rolls, for example, right? Throwing out ballots for minor mistakes. There are efforts to, and so this can be touchy for some people, but it has a racially discriminatory effect related to having to have like a driver's license and to be able to show that when you vote, which some states have, Michigan does not, right? There have been efforts to, well, there are others, but I'll stop there, okay? So yes, there are opportunities to discriminate and people are proving it. The other thing from the quote was, is there a will to discriminate? It's good to ask yourself, right? Is there a will by some people to discriminate with regard to the ballot, right? And I think in the past we wanted to say, well, surely nobody wants to do that, right? That is a naive perspective, I would say, right? There is a will to discriminate, right? And the last one is to think about, with regard to the quote, who are those certain potential voters, right? Who is it that people want to keep from voting? Okay, it's worth thinking about those things. And one thing just a little bit as an aside, often people who want to prevent everyone from having access to the ballot box are willing for there to be collateral damage, so to speak. Think about something like the poll tax, for example, right? The poll tax would be, right, you have to pay to vote. It was racially discriminatory in its effect disproportionately when it was introduced against black voters, right? Because of the alignment, because of history of slavery and alignment of issues of economics and race, it had a disproportionate effect on ethnic minority voters, namely African Americans, okay? Did it also affect other voters who were not black? Sure it did. Poor whites, right? Were the people who came up with the voting laws ignorant of that? Like, oh, gee, we didn't know that it was going to keep poor whites from voting. No, they weren't schmucks. They knew that that would happen, and they didn't care, right? That if we have to sacrifice the vote of a few poor white folks in order to keep the poor black folks from voting, that's a win, is what they would say, right? And I think that same mindset persists, right? That they are willing to have collateral damage to keep certain potential voters from voting. Okay. Another piece of evidence for does this matter? This is from a quote from a US Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, and it's from a 1939 Supreme Court case that is called Lane versus Wilson, which definitively ended something that's called the grandfather clause. I won't explain it. If you're curious, you can look it up. It was a really onerous means to try to keep African Americans from voting. All right? So here's the quote. The amendment, the 15th Amendment, the amendment nullifies sophisticated as well as simple-minded modes of discrimination, right? It was saying essentially the new grandfather clause was a sophisticated mode of discrimination, right? He's saying that's illegal just like the dumb ones. All right. It hits onerous procedural requirements which effectively handicap the exercise of the franchise by the, remember this is 1939, colored race, although the abstract right to vote may remain unrestricted as to race, right? So he's saying that people can come up with complex schemes that don't seem like they're intended to discriminate by race, but everybody knows they're going to discriminate by race, and that's not okay, right? That's not okay. The sad thing is this ruling from 1939 no longer seems to govern the Supreme Court's rulings, I would say. And in fact, both simple-minded and sophisticated modes of voter discrimination are now in effect with the US Supreme Court's tacit approval, okay? And you should be alarmed by that, right? We should all be alarmed by that, right? Moreover, I would say it seems that the realist model of jurisprudence that this quote represents, right, the idea that you look beyond the narrow language of a statute, that you treat it in a technocratic way when judging its constitutionality is no longer in effect, right? The court is looking at the narrow language of things, and whatever happens as a result of state regulations of voting, well, that's just the way that it goes. Okay? All right. Now, perhaps the US Supreme Court will invalidate some of the voting schemes that states have developed since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are a bunch of them in the process of being litigated right now. Okay? Legal challenges are underway, but it is slow and it is burdensome, and in fact, that was what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to prevent, right? Is that the idea is, if I want to discriminate against you, right, you shouldn't have to bear all the burden, right, time-wise, cost-wise, et cetera, not being able to vote in the meantime, right? But that has gone away. Moreover, it is never ending the legal process, right? It's sad that a quote from 1946 still seems relevant here. In 1946, there was a journalist for the Pittsburgh Courier, which is one of the prominent African-American newspapers of the time. Journalist J.A. Rogers wrote the following for the Pittsburgh Courier about these efforts, never-ending efforts to restrict equal access to the ballot. Remember, it's 1946. Quote, and J.A. Rogers is black. Every time the United States Supreme Court outlaws one of these Negro stoppers, a new one is invented, right? And I think that is the fear for today as well, right? That even if the court rules against them, the states will just look for new ways to get around it and to discriminate according to race. Okay. So let me pause and say, so I really hope that you think that America has a voting rights problem, right? That you understand how it came about, right? That you see it as significant, that it's not just a historical problem, all right? But the big question then is, right, what can be done about it, right? What can be done about it, all right? I have some ideas that I will suggest, and I hope that you will think about ones, and I hope that we'll have a time to talk about them at the end in addition to other things. But let me make a few suggestions, right? The first, and this one can be touchy for people, but I'm not going to pull any punches on this one, is the first thing that you can do is resist the unfounded claims about voter fraud that are often used to authorize new voting restrictions, okay? And by resist, I mean don't believe these claims about voter fraud. That's certainly true, but also challenge them when they are used as a rationale for restricting people's access to vote, okay? So let me say this plainly. And again, I know that this is touchy for some people, but I have complete confidence in the truth of this. So I will say it plainly. America does not have a significant voter fraud problem. What America does have is a fear-mongering, conspiracy theorist, self-interested, baseless accusation problem on the subject of voter fraud, okay? And that is just the truth of things, okay? So radical changes to states' voting regulations, right, which are taking place, right? As soon as what's called the pre-clearance component of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was invalidated by the Supreme Court in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. As soon as that happened, states came up with new voting procedures, right? And they were radical changes, right? About absentee ballots, right? For example, when the polling places would be open, how you could register, all kinds of things. There are radical changes to state voting regulations and procedures, right? It seems to me that these things should only happen if there is clear, proven, radical threats to the integrity of the voting system, right? I think if that happened, we would say, okay, right? If you're gonna make radical changes, but there was a radical problem that everybody understands, right? There's strong evidence for it, okay, right? But that is not what has happened, right? That is just not the case, right? And I would say too, even if there were significant voter fraud, which once again, let me emphasize, there's not, a person would need to show that the proposed regulations and procedures would stop it, right? If I asked you, right, if you were proposing anything, any course of action, right? Let's do this because it's gonna fix, because of this problem, let's do this, right? I would say, well, you need to show me that this action will actually have a good chance of solving that problem, right? Not just some kind of generic problem. But once again, this is not the case, right? And you would also want to show that it's not going to cause other problems, right, that are maybe worse, right? But once again, that is not the case, right? That because of baseless accusations, radical changes have been made. Even if there were voter fraud, it's not clear that those efforts would stop it. And they have significant, this is even a benign way to put it, they have significant side effects, right? And the side effects undermine people's equal rights. That's where we're at. So here's some questions I hope you'll use to confront those who are advocating for, who are undermining equal rights in this way, especially by suggesting that there's widespread voter fraud. First of all, you could ask simply, right? Why are you doing this, right? Or why do you support this? Okay, can you prove that voter fraud is a problem? Because the burden of proof is on you, right? That people often want to assume that they can just assert that there's voter fraud rather than prove it. They should have to prove it, okay? Why is this the way to solve a hypothetical or extremely limited problem is another question you can ask people, right? Can you prove that this procedure, that this voting regulation will solve the problem, right? Ask, will it have side effects, right, so to speak? Is it going to be racially discriminatory? Is it going to discriminate against people with physical disabilities, for example? I think this is something that people often don't think about, right? If you have absentee voter balloting and you put the ballot box so there's like only one in an area of 100 miles, right? What do people who have severe physical disabilities who don't have access to transportation do, right? Look into it, right? There are things online talking about disability activists on this score, right? It's a negative effect of these laws. Unintentional effect, in this case, most likely, but nonetheless, it's an effect. Right? Ask them, do you understand why people are concerned that these laws are racially discriminatory? Right? Do you care about these effects? Can't you think of another way to stop voter fraud, even if it were true, one that's more effective, one that has fewer problems, and one that's motivated by trying to get every eligible voter to the ballot box rather than trying to keep certain potential voters away? Right? These are questions that we can ask public officials at high level and at the local level about efforts to restrict the franchise. All right? Second thing that can be done is that, and this one's pretty easy, right, is everyone can become more educated about the problem and support organizations that are working to solve it. If you want to know the names of some books, there are a couple that I can recommend to you. I won't do so now, but if you have questions afterwards, I would be happy to mention them, right? As for organizations that you can support, I can recommend two in particular. One is an organization called the Brennan, B-R-E-N-N-A-N, the Brennan Center for Justice. It's sponsored by New York University. And the other one is the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Both of these are great organizations which do great work. They will help keep you informed about issues that are upcoming and point to things that you can do. They also, of course, take financial donations, and they depend on financial donations, right? If the responsibility for ending voter discrimination ends up falling on the legal process, right? People who, like a person who says, I've been discriminated against, I need to take the state to court, right? Going to court isn't free, right? It's expensive, okay? And the lawsuits can last a long time. And the NAACP will take them on, but it's not any less expensive for them, right? And they raise money in order to help ensure equal voting rights in the United States. Now, you might be thinking, right, well, that's nice, Professor Pauly, but I don't have a lot of money. Well, fair enough, right? But two things. One is, do you guys know about the Amazon Smile program at all? If you go to smile.amazon.com, you can designate a charity that will receive 5%. Amazon will send it their way of all the purchases that you make. And the Brennan Center is one of the charities that you can choose, right? So it's a great way that doesn't cost you anything, right, to be able to support equal voting rights in the United States. The other one, the NAACP, does not do that as far as I know, but there is actually a little bit of urgency on this one, is that right now they're having a fundraising drive, and this is a little bit surprising to me. Any donation that you make will be tripled by, this is the part that was a little shocking to me, the actors Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds actually gave a bunch of money and made a commitment to triple the donations that are made. The deadline is tomorrow, so you have to get it in. I made my donation today, and I hope that you might consider doing it, right? There is some urgency, at least, for really getting the biggest bang from your buck for a donation to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. All right. The third thing that you can do is get involved in the political process, and I will say especially at the state level, okay? People often think something like voting rights, well, that must be at the national level because the Supreme Court talks about it, and the US Congress is debating it. And that is true, right? There are two laws that are being debated that are before the US Senate right now. One of them is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, right? But if you live in Michigan, you live in a state where both senators support both of those things, right? And so there's not a lot there to do except maybe you can remind them of that, right? If you live in another state, hey, there's nothing wrong with reminding your senator that you support these things and explaining why. But, as I've mentioned, states establish voter qualifications, right? And wouldn't it be nice if we could head those problems off before they become problematic, right? How can you get involved at the state level? Because that's where voter qualifications and procedures come about, right? How can you educate yourself and advocate that your state not adopt those discriminatory procedures, right? So the last suggestions I have are these. Find ways to subvert efforts aimed at undermining equal voting rights, right? And second, help mobilize more voters to offset any losses that come through discrimination. By subvert, I mean this. We could talk more about this if you want to. Look for the gaps. I'll use, again, the term from 1946 by J.A. Rogers, right? Look for the gaps in the so-called Negro stoppers, to use his term. I realize it's an offensive term today, but you get the idea, right? Is where are the gaps, right? There used to be a real sort of spirit of like both subversiveness and kind of craftiness among civil rights advocates in the United States, right? It'd be like, well, we're holding this mass meeting and the police are gonna come and try to break it up, but the police won't have a place to park if we fill up the park. I mean, it'd be stuff like that, right? Like, how can we come up with these little ideas to keep these racially discriminatory things from happening, right? It was a certain just kind of level of like street smarts and craftiness, sometimes because that's the only power that people had, right? But sometimes I think that contemporary advocates could reclaim that spirit a little bit, right? And there are ways to reclaim that spirit. And by mobilizing more voters to offset losses, I mean, what can you do to help make some of these voter restrictions moot if they do take place, right? Again, they need to be fought in the courts and they need to prevent it in the first place, but you can't do it all, right? Sometimes things get through. What can you do? You can look for organizations that will come and help educate people in your church, in your community about voting, right? When do you need to register? What do you need to register? If you're a first-time voter, where do you need to go to vote, right? What's gonna happen when you get there? Are you gonna have to show your ID? For example, in Michigan, they will ask you to see your ID, right? But you don't have to have it, right? You could say, I don't have it, and you could sign a little verification. Some people don't know that. They go to the polls, they ask, can I see your ID? I don't have it, and they sort of think like, oh, well, I guess I can't vote, and they walk away. And they have been effectively disfranchised, right? But there are organizations that will come and talk to your church, your community, and let people know that is not the case, right? And you have helped prepare people to make sure that they are going to get their constitutional access to the ballot box, right? By connecting with those organizations. You can volunteer to drive people to the polls, right? Locally, for example, there's an organization called the A. Philip Randolph Institute from the great black labor leader from the 1930s and beyond, right? And will help coordinate those efforts, right? You can volunteer to drive people to the polls. You can volunteer to be a poll worker, right? Sometimes the lines get really long. Surely you voted and the lines are really long. Why does that happen? There are a variety of reasons, but one of them sometimes is because they don't have enough poll workers, right? And sometimes the effect of those lines is that it will keep ethnic minorities from voting, right? So we can talk about why that is, but it's often the case. Okay, so these are some things that you can do. In closing, let me emphasize that America indeed has a significant voting rights problem, one that benefits some people and disadvantages others. Indeed, the struggle to guarantee equal voting rights is a constant one, and it's exhausting, and it unfairly burdens people who are already marginalized in the United States. But it's a struggle at the heart of democracy, and it's one that is really, really worth being a part of. And so I hope that you will think about to use Christian language, biblical language, that you'll think about the great cloud of witnesses that surround us on this issue, right? People like Bob Moses, maybe some of you know, civil rights activist who died earlier this year and was involved in the Voter Education Project. People like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? A woman who is involved in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I think she's passed away, but her birthday was yesterday, right? That you will think about these great cloud of witnesses that surround us, that you will persevere, and that you will join your voice with theirs, and that you will join your voice with theirs in testifying for the cause of justice, right? So thanks for coming today, and I've made sure that we have enough time for questions. Again, they could be simple factual questions. If you want to ask something, well, you said this, and I'm not sure if that's true kind of question, that's fine. Don't feel like you're giving me grief, right? I can take it, that's fine. So whatever kinds of things you want to talk about, that you're curious about, that you would like to have a conversation about. Anyone? Like I said at the start, it's always hard to, no one can know everything, right? Neither you nor me. So if there are things that I talked about and you said, you're kind of implicitly assuming that we know something, but maybe we don't know that. That would be fine. Yes? Sure, what is purging voter rolls? So it's a practice that has picked up again, and it's a practice that was used historically to keep especially African Americans from voting, right? So what it is it would be when you register to vote, obviously there is a collective record right now, I'm assuming they're electronic, right, of who has registered to vote, right? And then when people actually vote, right, there will be a record of who actually voted in the election as well, okay? Now you might say, okay, well that's fine, but there will be, not all states do this, but some states will do it that they will compare the two things over time, right? And so they might say, right, well, you registered to vote, but you've never voted, and it's been like 3 elections now, and your name on the list of registered voters is sort of like cluttering up the records, so we're gonna purge you from the records, okay? So that's what it is. The problem is, of course, you might say, like, well, that's just a matter of record keeping, but it seems to me that you could ask a couple of things. How big of a deal is that really, especially in the age of electronic record keeping, right? If a person has registered to vote and never voted, ever, right? Like how much storage space does that take up on the server, right? Even if you have a lot of people, it seems to me not that much, right? So you might wonder, why are people doing anything about that in the first place? The other thing is that lots of places don't have rules. That's the problem that happens now about how, when, who gets purged. It's ripe for discrimination. Okay, so one of the things, for example, I can't remember which of the laws before Congress, I think it's the Freedom to Vote Act. One of the things that it is doing is saying, okay, if you are going to purge voter rolls, here are national standards for how that works so that it's not just haphazard, right? Because in the past, it would just be like, what do you know? Everybody's favorite white folks never get purged from the voter lists, right? But the black folks we don't want voting, well, okay. So yeah, so that's it. It's an excellent question. Yeah. You wouldn't be able to vote, and again, this is where it also becomes problematic, is the question of how do you get back into being able to vote again, right? And then also, so there's that. Now, in many cases, it's not that onerous, right? Although having to register to vote again is a pain in the butt, right? And the other problem is that people won't tell you, right? Is so that you'll be purged from the voter rolls and you show up to vote and it's, oh, well, you've been purged from the rolls. Or, well, I don't know why, but you're not showing up on the voter list, and then the burden falls on you to go figure out what happened, right? And in the meantime, you haven't been allowed to vote, right? And all of the work is your problem rather than the problem of the people who purged you from the voter rolls. Everybody see the idea of how this kind of stuff is problematic, right? How it leads to discrimination. And it puts the burden on the people who, at least it seems to me that the burden should not be on them, right? And again, the Voting Rights Act tried to prohibit that, but that portion of it was invalidated by the court in Shelby v. Holder, unfortunately. Right. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, so Shelby County v. Holder is one of them, and that's been a little while now. It's been almost 10 years now, I think. And what that did is it eliminated something. It eliminated one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act that was called the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act, right? And this is the one that kept it from being everybody's burden, right? So the way that it would work in particular was if there were the states that just had long patterns of racial discrimination in voting when the act was passed in 1965. If they were going to make changes to their voting procedures, they would have to submit them to the Justice Department for pre-clearance, right? The idea being is that it will prevent them from coming up with efforts to try to discriminate, even though they're not like discriminatory at face value, but in effect, everybody knows they're going to be racially discriminatory, right? So the way of stopping that from happening and having it be this endless cycle, again, and I'm worried we're back at that stage now, is the pre-clearance section. But the Shelby County versus Holder discrimination, the court decided that that provision of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional, and so it's no longer in play. All right, so that's one of them. The other one was this summer, and it is called Brinovich versus Democratic National Committee, and it was a case from Arizona, I believe. This one's more complicated to summarize quickly, and the repercussions are still being felt. But it deals, the preclearance is Article 5. Article 2 is the one that tries to determine what is in fact racially discriminatory. And cases, and Arizona came up with voting practices that most people thought would be discriminatory in their effect, right? And the Supreme Court said no, right? That we're gonna choose to look at the letter of the law here, right, in a fairly narrow way, and not really give any thought of what the outcome will be if these practices happen. And so that was a second really significant weakening of the Voting Rights Act. And that's why there are these two laws before Congress now, right? Right. But honestly, it's hard to be optimistic about them. And I naturally want to be an optimistic person about these sorts of things, but it's a little bit hard in this case, quite honestly, right? Right. I think many people, I mean, at the beginning when I ask you questions, right, constitutional amendments are going to be probably the way to solve some problems. But boy, good luck making that happen if you know how the process of constitutional amendments happen, right? Yeah.
So overall, do you think that voting laws need to be less mandated or more mandated on the federal level so that, because it's more heavy handed when we talk about voting laws.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, so with the federal laws that are being proposed now, I mean, what's at stake, of course, is you can pass a law, right? And then you can allow for provisions to try to enforce it. But, right, I mean, our society is incredibly litigious in all different kinds of ways. And you know that states are going to challenge it, right? That they're going to come up with procedures and they're going to challenge them in the court. And like I said, right now, it's hard to be hopeful that the Supreme Court will necessarily right, you hope the people that write the law have sort of learned the lessons and know what's what. But it's hard to have supreme confidence in it, quite honestly, right? So then what does that leave with one? It leaves one with constitutional amendment, right? Which is also, it's hard to be hopeful about that happening, right? Because it obviously has to go through Congress and then it has to be ratified by a proportion of the states. Or that you work at the local level. I think honestly there's more hope at the local level. If you look at public opinion about voting restrictions, that most people are not supportive of efforts to restrict the vote in unfair and unequal ways, right? Is that it's politicians that are doing it for self-interested reasons, and that's always been the case. Even when the 15th Amendment was passed in order to grant African-American men, it should be worth saying, access to the ballot box, it was not completely unpolluted by political motives, right? The Republican Party at the time thought that, well, if we enfranchise black men, maybe that will help offset the increase in voters in the South after the abolition of slavery and them rejoining the Union, right? So there's always a political dimension to it, no doubt. But politicians are very motivated by those things in a way that ordinary voters often are not, right? Most voters say, don't discriminate, and the vote is a right, not just a privilege, but that is not the way that their elected officials behave, including at the state level, right? I think there's hope at the state level, right? But you have to become educated and you have to get involved, right? Other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One, so again, the question about the way that these get reported in the news. Unfortunately, it's just a reality of the way that news often reports things, right? Like scholars of journalism will refer to it as like the performance of objectivity, right? Like, well, if we have a side and like both people involved in the debate are crazy, if you say like, well, crazy person A says this and crazy person B says this, well, we've done our due diligence by sort of covering this issue, right? I think most people would say like, no, you haven't helped people understand the reality of that issue in any way. You've just helped them hear two crazy positions that are diametrically opposed to one another, right? So one, I would say, is to be skeptical of the way that journalists report on these issues and try to find other ways to gain insights about it, is one of the things. And then the other is to, again, I would say that most people, I mean, in general, and this hasn't been true in the past, it provides an advantage for now, I think, that most people think of voting as a right, as a political right, rather than a privilege. There are some limits to that, I would say, especially with regard to people who have been convicted of crimes, right? People seem to then sometimes want to treat it as a privilege, then that it's okay to take away. But in general, people see voting as a right? And you can get a lot of mileage out of that, right? And especially that you're trying to deprive people of rights, right, for discriminatory reasons. And people need to be called out on that. And that's why the idea of like the voter fraud, for example, right? Don't just prove it, right? Prove it. Prove that there's voter fraud, right? The burden's on you, okay? Prove that it's significant, right? Those are things that journalists could do rather than just, well, politician X asserts that there's voter fraud, right? And even newspapers that will be a little bit more critical will say like, well, there were unsupported accusations of voter fraud, but then they go on to report what the person said. Okay. I mean, if it's obvious nonsense, don't report it, it seems to me, right? Because you're just distorting people's perceptions of things. Okay. Other things you're curious about or again, want to challenge or anything. All right, well, our time is nearly on an end. And when is the last time that, right, a professor was talking, you got done early, right? Okay. Especially at the end of the day. But I really want to thank you for coming. It's been a privilege talking with you. And if there are questions that you didn't want to ask out loud, I will stick around for a bit and I will be glad to talk with you now. Or if you need to run off, I will be happy to get contact info from you and we can talk later about it too. But once again, thanks so much for coming and good luck to you. Have a good rest of your day. Good luck with the rest of the semester. Take care.